Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss what it means to be a social conservative today in a context in which the Republican Party had a porn star speak at its recent convention, and the overwhelming evidence, including as set out in a long-form essay recently published by The Hub, shows that marriage and fertility rates continue to fall in much of the advanced world, including Canada and the United States. David, thanks as always for joining us.
I'm so glad to be back.
In our last conversation, we talked about the apparent decline of the influence of social conservative voters in the Republican Party during the Trump era. It seemed like a Faustian bargain. Roe versus Wade may have gotten overturned, which of course had been a longstanding priority, but the indignities that social conservatives have had to endure represent quite a trade-off. And some, like Ross Douthat, have argued that on net, Trump has done harm to the social conservative cause.
Yeah.
How do you assess the state of social conservatism in America today?
Well, the state of social conservatism has had a very, very, very bad 10 days. When Trump chose JD Vance as his running mate, disregarding advice from every major Republican donor, disregarding advice from Rupert Murdoch, listening to apparently his own two sons and to the former Fox broadcaster Tucker Carlson, he picked up JD Vance, and he then inherited all of this material that JD Vance has been putting on the public record. Somebody's made the remark that JD Vance is a very unusual politician and that everything he said before he went into politics is fine. He's in trouble for all the things he said after he went into politics, which is, again, usually completely the reverse of the norm. But he has said dozens of times incredibly hostile things about people in general and women in particular who don't have children. And it's like a textbook example of how not to play this game. Or rather, it's a textbook example of how to play this game if you want a little prize, which is social media clout, but not if you want a big prize, which is to win elections and make a difference for the ideas you supposedly care about. And that's what I'd like to talk about today, how to do it versus how not to do it.
Well, that's a great segue, because when we exchanged about what we might talk about today, you framed it in an email to me as follows: about how to talk and how not to talk about social conservatism. David, it implies that some social conservative ideas or messages may resonate with people and others will repel them. Why don't we start by having you just unpack your thinking?
It's not just messages. I mean, supposing you're running for town council and the big question in town is whether to build a new dam. And opinion is split 50-50. Some people say that, people point to the benefits of the dam, but others worry about the costs. Do you launch an attack on the half of the town that is skeptical of the dam by calling them swamp-loving degenerates, by calling them names, by insulting them and abusing them, and making even the people who are pro-dam think, your fixation on the dam is a little unhealthy. I don't think we're talking about the dam. I think we're talking about anger management issues you need to work out in some other forum than this political one. Like when politics is the business of finding collective answers to collective solutions, and working in a framework where some people will agree with you. Some people will never be convinced, but most people are kind of uncertain. Every policy has trade-offs, costs and benefits. Nothing works perfectly, and people don't want to be led by angry, vengeful weirdos. So it's very important not to look like an angry, vengeful weirdo, even if, by the way, the case for the dam is on balance stronger than the case against the dam. Like in this case, we genuinely face a problem of natality all over the Western world. And it's a problem not just because, for a bunch of reasons. It goes to the stability of our social insurance systems, all of which are based on taxing the young to pay for the old. And it's not just that this becomes a problem if there are fewer young and more old, but because of rising standards of living, what we need to pay the old is going to be endlessly rising. Medical costs go up, their pensions have to rise with the standard of living. And therefore, and the younger obviously are at the beginning of their earning careers, but we need to tax them more. So we want their earnings to be growing. We need larger numbers of them, not shrinking numbers. But it also has to do with, as if we don't reproduce ourselves, our societies age. The society become less entrepreneurial, less creative, less dynamic, less optimistic, more vulnerable to nostalgia. It becomes harder to recruit militaries to defend the societies if need be. There's just a lot of problems with an aging society, and so anyway, children are a joy. So that's and they give life meaning. And one of the things politics is about is we don't just want to accumulate GDP for the sake of putting numbers on the board. We want to enhance human happiness and well-being and flourishing, and nothing for most people in most of the time enhances their well-being and flourishing more than the joy of having a family and raising children. Not everybody, but a lot of people. So so it's a problem. How do you address it? Well, we don't know exactly what are the right remedies, and many of the obvious solutions turn out not to work. Child tax credits turn out not to work. Free daycare turns out not to work. And it doesn't, for our purposes here, it doesn't matter why, and it doesn't matter if maybe if you did it slightly differently, it might work better. We don't know what the answer is. So we're all in exploring mode. But here's some things that we do notice, that if you unleash and legitimize gender hostility between the sexes, as you see among young people, for example, very notoriously in South Korea, boy, that doesn't help. And if you have societies that are adjusted more to the way the wishes and aspirations of women, like Netherlands and Sweden, that does seem to help at least a little. But above all, if you want to sell an idea, you have to get buy-in from people. And if it's an idea about fertility, you especially need to get buy-in from women who do most of the work and bringing the next generation to the world. So the idea that you would campaign for your idea by treating women who don't comply with it as enemies, as psychopaths, as degenerates, as sociopaths. I mean, the kind of language that JD Vance has used since he entered politics. I mean, this is not going to do any good for anybody.
It also, in my mind, underestimates the potential resonance of some of his underlying predispositions. In preparing for our conversation, David, I went back to one of the first opinion columns I ever wrote for the National Post, which had a headline, "Are you a social conservative? You might be surprised." My basic argument was rooted in my own experience in a family neighborhood in Toronto, where I saw firsthand a lot of people who were not conservative and possibly even progressives, but who were great spouses and parents and were generally living out what you might describe as bourgeoisie values or social conservatism. They instinctively understood what Irving Kristol and James Q. Wilson and Charles Murray and others have shown empirically, that strong families are key to child and community development. In that sense, David, is the right future for social conservatism to redefine itself as less about, say, abortion or gay marriage or whatever Vance has been talking about, and more about strengthening the conditions for the so-called success sequence or bourgeoisie values, or however one ultimately comes to describe these conditions, which are really crucial to the success of families, individual families and communities as a whole?
I would put it even more simply than that. This is not Vichy France. We are not going to conscript women to have children for the benefit of the state. The message here is, how can people in politics need to remember they are public employees. The people are the boss. You are the employee. You work for them. And so the way that you should be talking about this in the area of natality, for example, is how can we develop policies to help you have the children you want? These are your choices. And we are here to make the choices more accessible to you. How do we help you to get the home you want? I'm not picking the home. I'm not designing it. I'm not telling you how many doors or windows you should have, what style of decoration you should use. That's up to you. I'm here to make sure that if you want it, it's easier for you to get it than it otherwise might be. How can we help to make sure that your streets are safe and walkable? And by the way, I think as we enter the 21st century, we've more than entered it. We need to take on board some events that have happened since 1975 in our concern. Like when there's a meme a little while ago where some right-winger put on Twitter an image of a beautiful town and said, Democrats can't win in places like this, a beautiful small town. in places like this. So the town turns out to be like Brattleboro, Vermont, or someplace where Democrats get 80% of the vote. And the point was, even this far right person understood that what we don't want for our families to live on giant 8-lane roads lined with fast food and box stores. We want to live on walkable streets. We want the kids to take the bicycle to their friends' houses. We want them to play outside and not have to watch them the whole time because we're fear that a truck is going to knock them down. And so the idea of incorporating walkability into a social conservative vision, that social conservatism just can't be wishing you had forever plastic straws and Dodge darts and McDonald's and polystyrene clamshells and just everything we ever had in 19. I mean, I was there. It wasn't so great in 1975. There's been a lot of progress. So the social conservative message is about work. It's about saving. It's about the ability to form a family. It's about the ability to have the children you want. It's about, and it's not about, I mean, obviously, politics is about arguments about what is the good life. And that it's not just about facts and figures. So there are visions of the good life here, but you, in a democratic society, you advance your vision of the good life by really elaborating and enriching all the ways that it is good and not denigrating others. I mean, I think one of the most important stories about politics ever is a story about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I'm sure I've told you this story before, but if so, I'm doing it again. So he's running for re-election in 1936 and probably against Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas. And the head of the Democratic National Committee gives a speech at some fundraising dinner in which he describes Alf Landon as governor of a typical prairie state. Now, in the lexicon of political abuse, typical is not the harshest word you can use, but he said it, and the Republicans made a big deal out of it. They made up billboards of Lincoln, said also from a typical prairie state. And Roosevelt wrote to the head of the DNC and said, look, this kind of language, especially from a New Yorker, doesn't help. If you had said one of our splendid prairie states, there would have been no issue. So just the Roosevelt's lesson was, and if you look back at Roosevelt's speeches, you will see how often he uses words like splendid and magnificent. That there's always a little embedded compliment. And even if people aren't listening to what he says, he's sort of soothing the waters. So if JD Vance he wouldn't have become the social media red hot superstar he did, but if he constantly said, I've become a father. It's the greatest source of joy in my life. It is my wife and I together have discovered new sources of meaning. I want to make this experience more available to more people. We've been very fortunate, so it's easy for us to afford it. I recognize it's expensive. Not everyone is going to have all the children they want, but we want to help as many people as they can to have as many of them. Again, that would not excite the audience for the Steve Bannon radio show. It wouldn't get Tucker Carlson inflamed. But it would make you sound like a kind of trustworthy person on this issue, especially to the women you're asking to bear the children.
Well, one possible entry point, it seems to me, is the work done by demographer Lyman Stone, who we've previously had on our podcast, which shows consistently in countries like Canada and the US, women are having fewer children than they themselves say they want. On average in Canada, for instance, the evidence suggests that women are having about 0.5 fewer children than they say they want in various surveys. And so, with that in mind, it prompts the question: what is the role of public policy to try to close the gap between preferences and outcomes when it comes to fertility?
Yeah, well, look, the public policy is like in every area. I mean, if we discover that access to less fresh fruit than they want, if we discover that people are constantly falling short of their own goals for accumulating retirement savings, we say, well, there's a limit always to what government can do to help. Government can't solve every problem, and government often shouldn't try. But you certainly start by thinking, what can you do? And supposing we discover another social conservative worry that young men aren't working as many hours as their fathers and grandfathers, maybe not are working not as many hours as women are, and this is causing all kinds of problems for them, for others. So, You don't imitate Edgar G. Robinson in the Ten Commandments and put on your Pharaoh slave driver costume and knock on doors with a whip and say, "Get out into the mud fields and make some bricks, you bums." You try to figure out, well, what is it? Why is it that they're not working? Is there anything government can do? We can't conscript them. It's a free society, and everything as a social conservative you say and breathe should begin with the understanding this is a free society, and we're trying. The goal is you as an advocate have views of the good life. They're not universally shared. They're not, and even where to the extent they're shared, they're not being acted on. So you want to promote your view of the good life. And second, you want to help people realize it if it's not immediately accessible to them. But you can't make them do it if they don't want to.
David, we're both married to ambitious, successful women. And it seems to me one obstacle for a modern social conservatism is to reconcile its impulses with the recognition that women are increasingly in pursuing careers and highly successful ones at that. What is a vision for social conservatism that meets women where they are as opposed to where maybe they've been in the past?
Well, it starts by making women the leaders and spokespeople in this movement, and by saying that if in this cause, if at least half the people speaking on these issues on your side are not women, you're probably alienating the people you most need to reach. I mean, when Tucker Carlson and JD Vance, and they're both married, they're both fathers, but still, they give off. The thing about this weirdo, have you been following this, that Democrats have begun deploying
Yes.
the claim that Republicans are weird, and Republicans are getting very upset about this, partly because hey, we do the name calling around here. Second, because they see a lot of they see many weird people on the Democratic side, and of course, it's a big country; they're full of weird people. But they're not understanding the code. I mean, that weird here doesn't mean unusual or aberrant. Weird here is very specifically to mean you are the kind of person who makes a lot of women uncomfortable, and every woman. There's a funny line on Twitter that somebody had is there's weird as in has an enormous collection of stamps, and there's weird as in you put your hand over your drink when he's in the vicinity. Okay, so you don't want to be that second guy who's like, that's the guy who's going to put the date rape drug in your drink if you're not careful. So foreground women in your movement. That's that, and they will, don't actually spend so much time figuring out how do I, the man, speak to women about things that are very much a women's concern. I just think it's generally true that when you're talking about how women can have the children they want, women know the children they want, and women have a lot to say about it. So foreground them, and it is just it is going to be unnerving if you have a natalist movement that is dominated by men.
Yeah, just in parentheses, I recognize it's apples to oranges, but in some ways, it seems to me the most powerful personification of a modern feminism or modern social conservatism is Amy Coney Barrett, not JD Vance, someone who has a large family, but also climbed to the at top echelon in her professional vocation. One of the questions I wanted to put to you in the context of this conversation is the interaction with some of these developments and large-scale immigration. Canada, as you know, David, has experienced massive population growth in recent years, driven by extraordinary levels of immigration. Is it possible in your mind that social conservatism goes through some form of cultural, racial, and even religious transformation in future years? And if so, what might be the political implications?
Well, this is a huge domain, and we're going to be speculating a lot. So I want to be careful what I say. And there's a real risk here of looking in the mirror and thinking you're looking out the window, just consulting your own guesses and projecting them. So I want to be real careful about that. But there have been a lot of instances in small American towns where people were very anti-Israel, very pro-Palestinian, try to make common cause with other people and discover that the same people who are with them on the Israel issue are also people who don't believe that women should wear trousers. And so you have this problem of who are your allies. New immigrant groups are going to have some very traditional ideas about women. I think North American and European conservatives need to make that's not what we mean. We don't look to Afghanistan and say, "Boy, have those guys got it right." What that's not our vision of what we're looking for. And importing a lot of people who have reactionary views about women and gay people that's not going to be helpful, because that's not what I hope we're trying to accomplish. The second thing is we need to understand that immigration, I think, and again, this is a little speculative, I think it is reverberating in ways that are detrimental to social conservatism, even if the immigrants themselves, because one of the big things I think that is hampering natalism is the cost of housing. You don't need to put each kid in his or her own bedroom, but if you're going to have 3 kids, you're going to need a bigger place than if you live alone or just as a couple. So the cost of, and one of the ways that immigrants economically advance is by saying we are prepared to accept lower standards of the standard of housing I get here in Toronto or Vancouver is a lot better than I had back in my home place, my point of origin, but it's a lot worse than the natives expect, especially if they're going to have a family. And that becomes my competitive advantage in this difficult society. I may not have the language, I may not have the skills, I may not have the credentials, but I'm willing to accept a much more compressed. So it normalizes tighter quarters. And it changes the price structure in ways that the more established inhabitants say, well, okay, if that's the price, I'm not going to have the 3rd child, the 2nd child, or even the 1st. And in Canada, this is especially acute because the job markets in Canada are so narrowly focused. Canada is not full of Charlottes and Denvers and Tucsons where you can have job growth amid cheap housing. The jobs are the original Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, Kitchener-Waterloo, maybe London, Ontario. That's basically that. Those are the job markets. And housing there is necessarily finite. Now, maybe Canada can figure out some way to create jobs in all kinds of ways, and maybe through higher tech solutions, you can have more. You can find a way that you can live in Fredericton and telecommute to work in Toronto. But pending that day, there is this interaction. But I think I think maybe the word social conservatism here needs a rebranding, because if you are tempted to think that joining with people with extremely reactionary and repressive views about women and gays is your way to advance your pro-work, pro-safety, pro-child, pro-family agenda, maybe you're thinking about your agenda in the wrong way.
Let me put a penultimate question to you. We couldn't get through a conversation about social conservatism without me asking about abortion. You've argued on previous episodes, David, that today it's probably a net loser for the Republicans, to the extent that in the post-Dobbs era, the party is painted by the most uncompromising positions among its ranks. It prompts the question for me, notwithstanding obvious state-level differences, what do you think the equilibrium on abortion policy is across the country?
Can I evade that question and say something else, which is something the thing that's closer to my heart on this question?
Of course.
I've written this again and again. There was a time when the alcohol abuse is a serious problem. And there was a time when people thought, when opponents of alcohol abuse thought the answer was ban alcohol. If you ban alcohol, you'll put an end to alcohol abuse. Guess what? That didn't work. What we have discovered in this instead is by saying everyone should drink a little less. And when you drink, don't drive. And you certainly, we're going to, there are a lot of things that don't mix, don't get on up, don't try to pilot a boat. And we have seen tremendous improvements in vehicular safety. And we do see that people drink less than they did a century ago. So I would say, like, my message to the pro-life movement is I agree with them that abortion is always a very sad and undesirable thing, or almost always. So your mission should be, how do we have fewer abortions? And then you would notice, by the way, we've been succeeding. In the United States, I think that the peak, there were about over 1 million abortions a year, maybe closer to 1.2. Now they're about 750,000 abortions. That's progress. That's like, why can't you, it's such an apocalyptic movement. You can't say, hey, we have cut by 1/3 the number of abortions that occur every year. And there are a lot of reasons for that. reductions in teen pregnancy. The profile of a woman who has an abortion today is a woman in her middle 20s who already has one child. It's not the scared 16 or 17-year-old that it would have been in the 1970s. And easier access to birth control, and just generally probably less drugs and alcohol among young people. Who knows? But if you're, my advice to them is that, you need to think, I would say, think about how you reduce the next 300,000 abortions. What do you have to do to get the figure from the 700 and 750 or whatever it is today to 400? What would that look like? You don't have to say that out loud and upset your most. You say, we're working toward 400,000 abortions a year. How do we do that? And suddenly you would realize maybe if it turns out that the reason so many of the women are having abortions is they're women in their middle 20s who already have one child, know what it's about, but they've lost in the past 12 months, and this is what you'll discover, they've lost a job or a relationship has ended, and they discover themselves unable or afraid of pregnancy number 2. You say, well, what if they got $1,000 a month for that child? What if we continued child nutrition programs to age 5? What if school lunches were tastier? You start thinking about those. Would that make a difference? Maybe. But if you always think, how can I be like in the child's parable, the sun and not the rain cloud? That's the Aesop fable, right? They need to make the man take off the cloak, and the wind tries to blow the cloak off, and the sun just makes it warm, and the man takes his cloak off voluntarily. How do you give people what they want? That should be the question that everyone in politics asks.
Well said. Let's wrap up with having you just reflect on any final advice that you have for social conservatives or the social conservative movement. How do they restore their influence without wrecking their credibility or doing damage to their integrity?
Don't put angry people on TV. Recruit spokespeople who seem happy and well-adjusted, and who look like their goal is not to punish people who disagree with them, but to spread happiness that they have found by their own in their own life through their own sources of meaning. And never repeat. Just engrave in your brain the story of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the magnificent, splendid prairie states. The way people love children, most of us. You surround yourself with beaming, happy children. How do you wouldn't you like more of these in your life? How do we make that possible for you?
That's a great way to wrap up our conversation. David, I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.